Harold and Margaret Chen were last seen on the deck of their anniversary cruise ship, watching the sunset over the Caribbean. Their cabin was found undisturbed the next morning, dinner still warm on the table, champagne glasses half full. No distress calls, no witnesses, no surveillance footage. For 14 years, their disappearance baffled maritime investigators, until a fisherman's net pulled up evidence that revealed a shocking truth. What he found will make you question everything you thought you knew about safety. March 8, 2024, 6:47 a.m. Marcus Williams felt his fishing net hit something heavy 40 miles northeast of Cozumel, in the deep Caribbean waters where he'd been working for 30 years. At 54, Marcus had pulled everything imaginable from these depths. Old anchors, discarded ship equipment, even a motorcycle that some drunk tourist had somehow managed to lose overboard. But this felt different, heavier, more deliberate. As the winch groaned under the unusual weight, Marcus's first mate Carlos shook his head and grinned. "Mon, what do you think we caught this time? Another refrigerator from cruise ship?" But when the net broke the surface, neither man was smiling. Tangled in the mesh weren't the usual fish or ocean debris. These were personal belongings. Jewelry that caught the morning sunlight, camera equipment in a waterproof case, and something that made Marcus's blood run cold. A pair of wedding rings still connected by a chain, engraved with Chinese characters and the date 1958. Marcus had grown up in Port Royal, where his grandfather had taught him to read the ocean like other men read newspapers. He understood that the Caribbean didn't give up its secrets easily, especially not secrets that had been buried for more than a decade. But here, spread across his fishing deck like evidence from a crime scene, were belongings that told a story of lives interrupted. The camera case was what convinced him this wasn't random ocean debris. Professional equipment, expensive, the kind that serious photographers carried on once-in-a-lifetime trips. Marcus carefully opened the waterproof seal and found a digital camera that, impossibly, still functioned after 14 years underwater. When he powered it on, the last images nearly stopped his heart. An elderly Asian couple, arms around each other, smiling against the backdrop of a cruise ship deck. The timestamp read March 13, 2010. The woman wore the same jewelry that was now tangled in his fishing net. "Carlos," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just stumbled into something far bigger than a day's fishing. "Give me the marine radio. We need to call the Coast Guard." As Carlos worked the radio, Marcus studied the other items in his net. Room service plates with the Royal Caribbean logo. Champagne glasses still bearing fingerprints preserved by the salt water. A man's wallet with U.S. currency and what appeared to be cruise ship identification cards. The Coast Guard operator who answered Marcus's call had heard plenty of strange fishing stories over the years, but this one was different. These weren't just random belongings lost overboard. They were evidence of people who'd vanished, and Marcus Williams had just become the first person in 14 years to find proof of what had happened to them. By noon, Marcus's fishing boat was surrounded by Coast Guard vessels, FBI Marine units, and investigators who'd been waiting 14 years for exactly this kind of break. The Harold and Margaret Chen case, one of the most famous cruise ship disappearances in maritime history, was about to be blown wide open by a Jamaican fisherman who'd been in the wrong place at exactly the right time. What Marcus had pulled from the depths wasn't just evidence of a missing persons case. It was proof of murder, cover-up, and a cruise industry secret that powerful people had spent 14 years and millions of dollars trying to keep buried beneath Caribbean waters. Harold Chen had built his American dream, one carefully calculated engineering decision at a time, but his greatest achievement wasn't the Boeing aircraft he'd helped design or the patents that bore his name. It was the woman sitting beside him on their living room couch in March 2010, planning the adventure they talked about for 52 years of marriage. "Margaret, are you sure about this cruise?" Harold asked, studying the Royal Caribbean brochure their children had given them for Christmas. At 73, he approached every decision with a methodical precision that had made him one of Boeing's most trusted engineers. "We've never been away from home for more than a long weekend." Margaret Chen smiled with the patience of a woman who'd spent 5 decades married to a man who analyzed everything twice. At 71, She'd been the steady anchor while Harold built their life from the ground up, working double shifts at the library to support his engineering studies, raising 3 children while he traveled for Boeing, managing their household with the efficiency that had made their modest Seattle home feel like a palace. Harold, we've been talking about seeing the Caribbean since 1958, she said, pointing to the cruise photos of turquoise waters and white sand beaches. We saved for 30 years to give the children college educations. We worked through every vacation to pay off the house. When are we going to live for ourselves? Their love story had begun in Seattle's International District in 1957, when Harold was a young Chinese immigrant studying engineering at the University of Washington, and Margaret was the librarian who helped him practice English by reading American novels aloud. They'd married on a shoestring budget, honeymooned at Pike Place Market, and spent their first anniversary eating takeout Chinese food in their tiny apartment while Harold studied for a citizenship test. 52 years later, their 3 children, Michael the attorney, Susan the nurse, and David the tech executive, had pooled their money to buy their parents the golden anniversary cruise they'd never been able to afford. 7 days in the Caribbean aboard the Royal Caribbean Majesty, with a balcony cabin overlooking waters they'd only seen in travel magazines. The kids researched everything, Margaret said, reading from the thank you note their children had included with the cruise tickets. This ship has won safety awards. The route goes to all the islands we used to talk about visiting. And Harold, we have a balcony. We can watch the sunrise with our morning coffee and the sunset with our evening tea. Harold studied the ship's specifications with an engineer's eye for detail. The Royal Caribbean Majesty was 1,020 feet long, capable of carrying 2,500 passengers, with state-of-the-art navigation and safety systems. The cabin their children had selected was on Deck 8, midship for stability, with an ocean view that would let them watch the Caribbean waters they dreamed about for half a century. Most importantly, the cruise departed March 10th, exactly 52 years after their first date, when Harold had taken Margaret to see a movie at the International District Theater and promised her that someday they'd travel the world together. We're really doing this, aren't we? Harold said, taking Margaret's hand and feeling the wedding ring he'd placed there in 1958, when he promised to love her for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death do them part. We're really doing this, Margaret confirmed, squeezing his hand with the strength of a woman who'd waited 5 decades for this adventure. 7 days of sunrises and sunsets, just you and me and the ocean. They spent the rest of that March evening planning their cruise wardrobe, researching Caribbean culture, and calling their children to share their excitement about the trip. None of them could have imagined that within a week, Harold and Margaret Chen would be dead, victims of a crime that the cruise industry would spend 14 years covering up to protect their reputation and profits. The American dream they'd built together was about to become a nightmare that would expose the dark side of an industry built on promises of safety and luxury. March 10, 2010, 2:47 p.m. Harold and Margaret Chen stood at the rail of the Royal Caribbean Majesty, watching the port of Miami's skyline disappear into the afternoon haze as the ship began its 7-day journey into the Caribbean. After 52 years of dreaming about this moment, they were finally living it. 2 kids from Seattle's Chinatown who'd worked their entire lives for 7 days of luxury and adventure. Their cabin, 8247, was everything their children had promised. A midship balcony room with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to a private deck overlooking endless blue water. Harold had spent the morning arranging his photography equipment, determined to document every moment of their golden anniversary cruise. Margaret had carefully unpacked the new dresses she'd bought for their formal dining nights, each one representing years of saving quarters and a coffee kin marked Caribbean dreams. "Look at this, Margaret," Harold said, reviewing the ship's daily activity schedule. Dancing lessons at 3 p.m., cultural lectures about Caribbean history at 4 p.m., and the sunset deck party starts at 6:30. We could stay busy from morning until night. But Margaret had simpler plans. She settled into a deck chair with a romance novel she'd been saving for this trip, watching her husband of 52 years set up his camera to capture their first afternoon at sea. This was the Harold she'd fallen in love with methodical, caring, determined to preserve every precious moment for the grandchildren who'd inherit their memories. The ship's routine was intoxicating in its luxury. Each morning brought coffee and pastries delivered to their balcony, where they'd watch the sunrise paint the Caribbean waters in shades of gold and pink. Days were filled with activities designed for couples their age. Lectures about island culture, gentle fitness classes, and afternoon tea service that reminded Margaret of the library charity events she'd organized for 30 years. But it was their evening ritual that captured the magic Harold and Margaret had been seeking. Each day at 6:45 p.m., they'd make their way to Deck 10, finding a quiet spot at the starboard rail to watch the sunset together. Other passengers rushed past them toward dinner reservations and entertainment shows. But the Chens had learned that the most precious moments couldn't be scheduled. 52 years ago, you promised to show me the world, Margaret said during their third sunset, her hand in Harold's as they watched the sky turn purple over the Caribbean horizon. Look at us now. Harold squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of a life well lived and dreams finally realized. Tomorrow they'd dock in Cozumel for their first shore excursion. Mayan ruins and cultural centers they'd studied in travel books, but never imagined they'd actually visit. The ship's safety record was impeccable, the crew professional and courteous, and their fellow passengers were couples like themselves, retirees finally taking the trips they'd postponed while building careers and raising families. The Royal Caribbean Majesty felt like the safest place on Earth, a floating city with security cameras, trained staff, and emergency procedures that would protect them from any danger. March 13th dawned perfect for their Cozumel excursion. Clear skies, calm seas, and the promise of exploring Mayan ruins they'd read about in Margaret's library books, but never dreamed of seeing in person. They returned to the ship at 4:30 p.m., loaded with souvenirs for their grandchildren and photographs that would preserve this perfect day forever. Tonight's our anniversary dinner, Margaret reminded Harold as they freshened up in their cabin. Room service, champagne, and sunset watching from our balcony. Just like we planned. Harold checked his camera equipment one final time, making sure the batteries were charged for what would be their most important photographs, documenting the golden anniversary celebration that had taken 52 years to plan. Neither of them knew that powerful people had been watching their routine, noting their expensive camera equipment, their jewelry, their obvious prosperity. And neither could have imagined that their perfect cruise was about to become a nightmare orchestrated by crew members who viewed elderly passengers not as guests to be protected, but as targets to be robbed. March 13th, 2010, 6:15 p.m. Harold and Margaret Chen left their cabin for what would be their final sunset together, walking hand in hand toward the elevator that would carry them to Deck 10 and the evening ritual that had become the highlight of their Caribbean cruise. The ship's security cameras captured them entering the elevator, Harold carrying his camera bag and Margaret clutching the shawl she'd worn to every important moment of their 52-year marriage. They emerged on Deck 10 at 6:22 p.m., the last confirmed sighting of the couple that would puzzle maritime investigators for 14 years. Other passengers were heading toward the main dining rooms for early dinner seatings, leaving the upper decks relatively empty, except for a few dedicated sunset watchers who discovered the same magical viewing spots the Chens had claimed as their own. Harold set up his camera equipment at their usual location along the starboard rail, positioning his tripod to capture both the sunset and Margaret's profile as she watched the Caribbean sky transform into shades of gold and crimson. These would be the final photographs in a camera that had documented 52 years of love, family celebrations, and dreams finally realized. At 6:45 p.m., as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the ship's security camera system experienced what would later be described as a routine technical malfunction. For exactly 43 minutes, the cameras monitoring Deck 10 recorded nothing but static, creating a perfect blind spot in the vessel's surveillance network. When the cameras resumed normal operation at 7:28 p.m., Harold and Margaret Chen had vanished. Their absence wasn't noticed immediately. The maitre d' at Prego, the ship's Italian specialty restaurant, assumed the elderly couple was simply running late when their 7:30 p.m. anniversary dinner reservation went unfilled. Other passengers had seen them watching the sunset, but in the rush toward evening activities, no one paid attention to when they'd actually left the deck. It wasn't until 8:30 p.m., when their table remained empty despite repeated announcements, that restaurant staff called their cabin. The phone rang unanswered in room 8247, where their anniversary dinner sat waiting. Room service meals still warm on elegant china, champagne glasses filled and ready for a toast that would never happen. Ship security was notified at 9 p.m. when a steward used his master key to check the cabin. What he found defied every assumption about passenger disappearances. Harold and Margaret's room looked like they'd stepped out for a few minutes and planned to return immediately. Expensive jewelry lay on the dresser. Prescription medications sat beside the bathroom sink. Harold's backup camera equipment remained carefully arranged on the desk. Most puzzling of all, there was no evidence of struggle, robbery, or distress. The room service dinner had been ordered for 6 p.m. delivery, suggesting the couple had planned to return from sunset, watching for a romantic anniversary meal in their cabin. Champagne chilled in an ice bucket. Anniversary cards from their children sat propped on a nightstand. Captain Rodriguez was notified at 10 p.m., initiating the ship's emergency protocols for missing passengers. The massive vessel altered course, returning to the area where the Chens had last been seen, while crew members searched every accessible area of the ship. Public announcements requested the Chen family to contact guest services immediately. But Harold and Margaret Chen were gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. No witnesses reported seeing them leave the sunset deck. No emergency beacons had been activated. No man overboard alarms had sounded. The Coast Guard was notified at 2 a.m. on March 14th, launching a massive search operation that would cover 200 square miles of Caribbean waters. Helicopters scanned the ocean surface while rescue vessels searched for any sign of two elderly passengers who'd somehow disappeared from a ship carrying 2,500 people without anyone noticing. The official investigation would conclude that Harold and Margaret Chen had somehow fallen overboard during their sunset watching, victims of a tragic accident that left no evidence and triggered no safety systems. But that conclusion was a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the truth about what had really happened to two innocent people whose only crime was trusting that a cruise ship would keep them safe. March 14th, 2010. 6:23 morgens. U.S. Coast Guard helicopter pilot Sandra Morrison scanned the Caribbean waters below, searching for any sign of Harold and Margaret Chen in the vast expanse of ocean that had swallowed them without a trace. This was her third missing passenger case in 5 years, and each one followed the same impossible pattern. Elderly passengers vanishing from cruise ships without witnesses, without evidence, without explanation. The search operation was massive by maritime standards. Coast Guard cutters from Key West and San Juan converged on the Royal Caribbean Majesty's route, while Mexican Navy vessels joined the effort in international waters. Underwater sonar equipment scanned the ocean floor for bodies that might have sunk rather than floating to the surface as drowning victims typically did. But Michael Chen, the couple's eldest son and a prominent Seattle attorney, wasn't satisfied with the official search efforts. Flying to Cozumel with his siblings Susan and David, Michael brought the kind of legal expertise that had made him one of the Pacific Northwest's most successful civil rights lawyers. What he discovered about cruise ship disappearances would shock him more than any case he'd ever handled. This isn't the first time, retired Coast Guard Captain James Morrison told the Chen family during a private meeting at the Cozumel Port Authority. I've worked 16 cruise ship disappearances in the past decade. Same pattern every time. Elderly passengers with expensive belongings. Security camera malfunctions. No witnesses. Bodies never recovered. Morrison had spent 30 years in maritime law enforcement, and he'd learned to recognize patterns that officially didn't exist. Cruise lines reported passenger disappearances as isolated accidents, but Morrison's private database told a different story. Wealthy elderly passengers were vanishing at rates that defied statistical probability, always under circumstances that prevented thorough investigation. The Chen family hired maritime investigator Patricia Hayes, a former FBI agent who specialized in cruise ship crimes. What Hayes discovered during her investigation painted a disturbing picture of an industry that prioritized corporate reputation over passenger safety. Royal Caribbean's internal incident reports, obtained through aggressive legal discovery, revealed dozens of passenger overboard incidents that have been classified as accidents without proper investigation. Your parents were targeted, Hayes told the family during a confidential briefing 6 months after the disappearance. Expensive camera equipment, jewelry, obvious prosperity. Someone on that ship was watching them, learning their routines, waiting for the right opportunity. But Hayes's investigation hit bureaucratic walls that seemed professionally constructed. Crew members who'd been working the night of the disappearance were transferred to ships sailing under different flags before they could be interviewed. Security footage from cameras adjacent to the malfunctioning units was mysteriously corrupted. Even passenger manifest records showed inconsistencies that suggested deliberate tampering. Most disturbing of all was Royal Caribbean's response to the family's quest for answers. The company's legal team offered a settlement within weeks of the disappearance, a substantial sum in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements that would prevent the Chen family from discussing the case publicly. When the family refused, the company's cooperation with the investigation ceased entirely. They know something, Susan Chen told her brothers during one of their weekly strategy meetings. As a trauma nurse, she'd learned to recognize the signs of institutional cover-ups. Companies don't offer million-dollar settlements for accidents. They're trying to buy our silence. The FBI's investigation was equally frustrating. Agent William Hayes, no relation to the private investigator, acknowledged that cruise ship disappearances fell into a jurisdictional gray area that made prosecution difficult. Ships sailing in international waters operated under maritime law that favored corporate interests over passenger rights. We can investigate, but prosecution requires evidence that simply doesn't exist in these cases, Agent Hayes explained to the family. No crime scene, no physical evidence, no witnesses. Even if we suspect foul play, proving it in federal court is nearly impossible. By 2012, the official investigation had been quietly closed. The Coast Guard concluded that Harold and Margaret Chen had fallen overboard during their sunset watching, their bodies lost to Caribbean currents. Royal Caribbean implemented new safety measures, higher deck railings, additional security cameras, enhanced crew training, while maintaining that the Chen disappearance had been a tragic accident. But the Chen family refused to accept official conclusions that ignored obvious evidence of foul play. They established the Harold and Margaret Chen Maritime Safety Foundation, funding research into cruise ship disappearances and advocating for stronger passenger protection laws. David Chen, the youngest brother and a tech executive, used his digital forensics expertise to analyze the ship's electronic records. What he discovered would eventually provide the breakthrough that investigators had been missing. Evidence that the security camera malfunctions hadn't been accidental, but had been orchestrated by people with access to the ship's surveillance systems. 14 years is a long time to carry unanswered questions about parents who simply vanished into thin air. By 2020, the Chen children had aged into the same generation their parents had been when they'd boarded that cruise ship, but they'd never stopped searching for answers that the maritime industry seemed determined to keep buried beneath Caribbean waters. Michael Chen had built his legal career on cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch: civil rights violations, corporate cover-ups, institutional negligence. But his parents' disappearance was the case that consumed him personally and professionally. His Seattle law office walls were covered with maritime law books, cruise ship safety reports, and photographs of Harold and Margaret that reminded him daily why he couldn't give up. Every year, more families contact us. Susan Chen told her brothers during their annual memorial gathering at their parents' favorite Seattle restaurant. Cruise ship disappearances that follow the exact same pattern. Elderly passengers with expensive belongings vanishing without witnesses, without evidence, without explanation. The Harold and Margaret Chen Maritime Safety Foundation had become a lifeline for families facing the same bureaucratic walls the Chens had encountered. Their database documented over 40 suspicious cruise ship disappearances since 2000, creating a pattern that law enforcement agencies seemed reluctant to acknowledge officially. David Chen had used his technology expertise to analyze digital evidence that investigators had either missed or ignored. His forensic examination of the Royal Caribbean Majesty's computer systems revealed something that challenged the official accident narrative. The security camera malfunctions on March 13, 2010 had been triggered by someone with administrative access to the ship's surveillance network. The cameras didn't fail accidentally, David explained to his siblings during a 2018 family meeting. Someone with intimate knowledge of the ship's security systems deliberately created that blind spot. This was planned, coordinated, and executed by people who knew exactly how to avoid detection. But knowledge wasn't proof, and proof was what prosecutors needed to file criminal charges. The Romanian crew members who'd been working that section of the ship had long since scattered to different vessels under various flags of convenience. Royal Caribbean's legal team had perfected the art of limiting liability while avoiding admission of wrongdoing. Captain Morrison, now retired but still investigating cruise ship disappearances as a private consultant, had documented disturbing patterns that extended far beyond individual cases. His research revealed that certain cruise lines experience passenger disappearances at rates significantly higher than industry averages, suggesting systematic problems rather than random accidents. Your parents weren't the first, and they weren't the last, Morrison told the Chen family during a 2019 meeting. I've identified at least 12 similar cases involving Royal Caribbean vessels. Elderly passengers, expensive belongings, security camera failures, no witnesses. Someone inside these ships is hunting passengers. The cruise industry had grown exponentially since Harold and Margaret's disappearance, carrying over 27 million passengers annually on routes that took them far from the reach of effective law enforcement. Maritime law created jurisdictional complexities that made prosecution difficult even when evidence existed. Ships flagged in countries with weak regulations could operate with minimal oversight, employing crew members whose backgrounds were never thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams was building a different kind of life in the Caribbean waters where the Chen family had died. As a third-generation Jamaican fisherman, Marcus had inherited fishing grounds from his grandfather and father, but economic pressures were forcing him to expand into deeper waters that had never been commercially viable. New fishing technology, deeper nets, GPS navigation, sonar fish-finding equipment allowed Marcus to work areas that had been inaccessible to previous generations. His expanded fishing grounds included the deep Caribbean basin northeast of Cozumel, where ocean currents created upwelling that attracted both fish and debris. In 2023, Marcus began noticing unusual patterns in his catches. Metal objects that didn't belong in deep ocean environments. Personal belongings that suggested human activity in areas where no one should have been. Camera equipment, jewelry, and identification documents that had somehow found their way to the ocean floor. By early 2024, Marcus had collected enough strange debris to fill a storage room in his Port Royal home. He'd never connected these findings to the cruise ship disappearances that occasionally made international news. But his inadvertent evidence collection was about to provide the breakthrough that maritime investigators had been seeking for over a decade. The ocean had kept Harold and Margaret Chen's secrets for 14 years. But it was about to give them up to a fisherman who'd been in the right place at exactly the right time to demand justice for two people who died simply because they trusted a cruise line to keep them safe. March 8, 2024. When Marcus Williams's net broke the surface with its unusual cargo, he knew immediately that he'd found something that would change everything. The wedding rings, the camera equipment, the waterlogged but readable passports. This wasn't ocean debris. This was evidence of lives cut short, preserved by the deep Caribbean waters for 14 years. Harold's camera contained the breakthrough investigators had been seeking since 2010. The final photographs told a story that contradicted every official report about the couple's disappearance. Images time-stamped after their supposed vanishing showed them alive, interacting with crew members in areas of the ship that had never been mentioned in maritime reports. The photographs revealed a systematic robbery operation. Harold had inadvertently documented crew members using master keys to access passenger cabins, photographing expensive belongings, and coordinating with accomplices through hand signals. His final images showed the faces of the men who would kill him and Margaret to prevent identification. When FBI forensic analysts enhanced the digital images, they discovered license plates, uniform name tags, and ship identification numbers that provided a roadmap to a criminal network operating throughout the Caribbean cruise industry. The same crew members appeared in Harold's photographs and Royal Caribbean employment records dating back years. Most damaging of all was the evidence of corporate knowledge. Harold's photographs showed ship security officers observing the robbery operation without intervening, suggesting institutional complicity that reached far beyond individual crew members. The breakthrough came when Romanian crew member Stefan Popescu, now working on a different cruise line, saw Marcus Williams's discovery reported in international news. 14 years of guilt and fear finally overcame his terror of retaliation. Popescu contacted the FBI with a confession that would expose the systematic murder of cruise ship passengers for profit. His testimony revealed that Harold and Margaret Chen had been targeted from the moment they'd boarded, marked for robbery based on their expensive belongings and perceived vulnerability. When they'd fought back against the cabin invasion, the robbery had escalated to murder to prevent identification of the perpetrators. April 2024. The arrests came 14 years too late, but they came with the force of justice that had been building pressure beneath Caribbean waters since Harold and Margaret Chen were murdered for defending their belongings. Stefan Popescu's confession led to coordinated international arrests spanning 3 countries and 5 cruise ships, exposing a criminal network that had been preying on elderly passengers for over a decade. The primary perpetrators, 3 Romanian crew members led by cabin steward Radu Ionescu, were arrested at ports in Miami, Barcelona, and Southampton. Their systematic robbery operation had targeted wealthy elderly passengers across multiple cruise lines, escalating to murder when victims resisted or could identify their attackers. The Chens weren't random victims. FBI Special Agent William Hayes explained during the press conference announcing the arrests. They were carefully selected based on their cabin location, expensive belongings, and perceived vulnerability. This was organized crime masquerading as hospitality service. The evidence recovered from Marcus Williams's net provided prosecutors with an unprecedented window into cruise ship crime. Harold's photographs documented not just his family's murder, but a pattern of robberies spanning years and multiple vessels. The same crew members appeared in passenger cabin invasions across different ships, suggesting a network that followed profitable routes and wealthy passenger demographics. Royal Caribbean executives faced criminal conspiracy charges for their role in covering up passenger disappearances. Internal company documents revealed that cruise lines had been aware of crew theft rings, but had chosen reputation management over passenger safety. Settling with families through non-disclosure agreements had been cheaper than implementing security reforms or cooperating with law enforcement. The trial in Miami federal court drew international attention to maritime safety issues that the cruise industry had successfully hidden for decades. Michael Chen testified about his parents' character and the family's 14-year search for truth. Marcus Williams was honored as a hero whose accidental discovery had finally provided justice for victims who'd been forgotten by everyone except their families. Stefan Popescu's testimony revealed the horrifying details of how elderly passengers were targeted for robbery and murder. The crew members had used master keys to enter cabins during dinner hours, stealing jewelry and cash, while passengers attended evening activities. When victims like Harold and Margaret returned unexpectedly, robbery escalated to murder to prevent identification. The broader investigation exposed similar crimes across the cruise industry. At least 40 elderly passengers have been murdered by crew theft rings over the past 2 decades, their deaths disguised as overboard accidents by companies more concerned with stock prices than passenger safety. For the Chen family, the convictions brought closure that had seemed impossible for 14 years. Harold and Margaret's remains were never recovered from the Caribbean depths, But their photographs had spoken from beyond the grave to expose the systematic violence that had taken their lives. "Our parents died protecting each other and fighting for their dignity," Susan Chun said during the sentencing hearing. They would be proud that their final photographs helped protect other families from the same fate. The cruise industry faced comprehensive reforms mandating enhanced crew screening, passenger protection protocols, and independent safety oversight. The Harold and Margaret Chen Maritime Safety Act required cruise lines to report all passenger incidents to federal authorities and established victim compensation funds for families affected by cruise ship crimes. Marcus Williams established a foundation supporting Caribbean fishermen's education, using his reward money to help others in his community. His accidental discovery had not only brought justice to the Chun family, but had exposed an international criminal network that preyed on society's most vulnerable travelers. Today, Harold and Margaret Chen are remembered not as victims who vanished without explanation, but as heroes whose love story exposed the dark truth about an industry that had prioritized profits over passenger safety. Their final photographs continue to protect elderly travelers, ensuring that cruise ship companies can never again dismiss passenger disappearances as simple accidents. The Caribbean waters that had hidden their murder for 14 years finally gave up their secrets, proving that truth, like love, is more durable than the corporate lies designed to bury it. Harold and Margaret Chen, who trusted their cruise ships' safety promises, proved that elderly passengers would die simply for defending their belongings, and ultimately exposed a maritime crime network so extensive it required 14 years of corporate cover-up to conceal the full scope of their crimes against vulnerable travelers. The fisherman's net that pulled up their belongings finally revealed the murder that cruise line prophets died trying to conceal. The ocean depths that hid systematic killing became a monument to the courage of one fisherman who chose justice over silence. How many other passengers lie beneath ocean waters, their murders disguised as accidents? What happens when cruise lines prioritize reputation over passenger safety? Can maritime travel survive when reporting crime becomes secondary to protecting profits? Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you believe cruise ship crimes against passengers still happen today? Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more investigations that prove truth is more durable than corporate cover-ups.